Now more than ever, innovative technologies are fueling change and sparking new ways of thinking. Collaboration between corporations and startups is key to staying at the forefront of these trends. However, finding the right startups can be expensive, time-consuming, and ineffective. But Plug and Play is here to help. As a corporate partner, you will gain access to a whole ecosystem of innovation. Discover startups that meet your tech interests. Stay updated on the latest trends and network with industry peers. We will help you during every stage of your innovation journey, no matter where you are and where you want to go. Get in touch today.
I think we can go ahead and get kicked off. I'm sure other folks will also trickle in, and I'll let them in. So excited to welcome everyone here today and to introduce Roxie, Dr. Roxie Mooney. She has been a workshop facilitator with us for a while now, and I think her pilot workshops are super valuable to both startups and to pilot champions that you may be working with. She's going to go through a little bit of content with you all today. I just ask that everybody mutes themselves throughout the presentation and puts any questions in the chat, and we can help address some of those questions. Either they'll be answered throughout the presentation or we'll get to them at the very end. So with that, Roxie, I'll let you introduce yourself and get started.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you, Ava, for having me here again. It's good to be here talking about piloting. My background is I'm the CEO for Legacy DNA. We're a strategy company for health innovators. And my doctorate is in commercializing technology innovations in healthcare. As Ava said, I've done a number of workshops with Plug and Play on piloting and a few other topics. And so it's just really great to join you guys today. And I'm confident that you will get quite a bit out of today's session. We're talking about pilots, right? We're going to be posing the question, how do we pilot successfully, whether you are a startup or a corporate, in a way that leads to profitability and better outcomes instead of what commonly happens, which I call the death trap. So depending on where you're coming from, I want to point out that this session will be valuable to you, whether you are with a startup or whether you're coming from the corporate pilot partner. And if you are a startup, wherever you are in any one of these buckets, whether you're developing an MVP, whether you're already in a pilot, you're looking for your first pilot, or maybe you're even looking for paying customers, you're still going to get quite a bit out of this session. And if you're a corporate, if you are in the planning phases, or if you're responsible for implementation and evaluation, or maybe even spreading and scaling those successful pilots throughout the organization, wherever either of you are in that continuum, you're definitely going to get a lot of value and benefit out of today's session. I made sure that we were thinking about all aspects and roles within the piloting process. So today we're going to cover three main ideas. So we're going to talk about just briefly about the death trap. And I imagine that as we do that, I'll probably see a lot of heads shaking yes in agreement, depending on where you are in your pilot experience. We'll also talk about the myths, the barriers, and the pitfalls, both for startups and for corporates. And then we'll wrap up the presentation talking about some tips and some best practices for both of those audiences and how you can work with the different pilot partners, whether you're on corporate or startup. So not all pilots lead down the path of profit or better outcomes, right? So some can really be death traps. And I would actually just ask you, how many of you have actually been in a pilot project and have had some challenges along the way? I see two hands. I see double hands up. Yes. So you will definitely know what I'm talking about here. You probably have heard the term death by pilot. I also like to talk about pilot purgatory, and I want to help startups and corporates not find themselves in pilot purgatory. And what do I mean by that? So I'm talking about when you are investing your heart, your time, your resources into a pilot program, and it ends up with no endorsement at the end if you're a startup, or maybe it's considered an unsuccessful pilot. It doesn't maybe lead to any sales for the startup. Maybe there's very little data that you've collected to really be able to prove or even disprove the hypothesis that you started with. Maybe it's just going on forever. And most certainly, if you are coming from the corporate point of view, we know that pilots really rarely scale and spread to large scale improvements. And that's having a successful pilot is great for the startup, giving them the clinical evidence that they need to be able to go down that commercialization process. But ultimately, the way we're going to be able to have that transformational impact in healthcare is going to be when those pilots are successful and they transition into those large scale deployments. So let's kind of talk about these myths, barriers, and pitfalls. And I've separated them into the different target audience or different groups, right? So this is for startups. So some of the myths I want to talk about are often when I'm working with pilot companies, the startup point of view, that they will have this perception that when they partner with a well-known brand, that automatically equals success. Whether it's a pharma company, whether it's a health system, whether it's a payer, if my brand is associated with this big brand, that's going to automatically mean that, home run success, and that's not the case. It really is a myth. There is a lot of work that goes into this piloting process to make sure that it's successful. A lot of times also startups think that they need to have all of the answers. And so when you're going through that early discussion of whether you are the right fit for them or not, you might make up stuff along the way instead of saying, I don't know. Or you might just feel like you have to have all of the answers. And really, when I'm working with those corporates, they really much rather the startup own what they don't know and what they do know, and then be able to work together in partnership with finding answers to some of those things. So just don't think that just because you don't have all the answers that you're not going to secure that pilot or you won't have a successful pilot. Kind of very similar to number one. Number three is when we think that this big player, this big brand, says that yes, that they'll do a pilot with us, that now we should just be so grateful and just so thankful that ABC brand said that they would do business with us, that we just forget all the negotiation and we agree to any terms that they put out there. We want to make sure that we're not doing that, because then we're leaving a lot on the table. And then the number four myth is that we need to do it for free. And just be thankful that they agreed to do the pilot, right? This is a myth, and we'll talk about how we're going to debunk this today. So then barriers. So as you guys know, and again, I kind of envision that you will be shaking your head yes through these, going, yep, very familiar with that. So COVID has really been a barrier in a lot of ways, with making it really difficult to be able to secure those pilots or even being able to execute them. So that can be an obstacle for us. Also, we talked about it, and you're going to see this common theme. I'll talk about, the scaling and the spreading of these large scale deployments throughout the organization. They really rarely scale. And so that's a barrier for us. Pilot projects, as you know, can take years to complete. And that's a problem. We want to be able to figure out ways to be able to get through this process much faster. Getting stakeholder buy-in. So a lot of times when someone says yes, they agree that they're going to do a pilot with us, we really kind of we need to be aware of those other barriers of, I got them to say yes to the pilot, but now I need to get other stakeholder buy-in. I need to make sure that I'm recruiting these end users, and obtaining data can certainly be a challenge and a barrier to success. Pitfalls. So in many ways, there are things just for you to be able to watch out for, right? To be mindful of. Sometimes the startups are really just very vulnerable to which way ever the wind blows, meaning that priorities for your pilot partner can change, as well as, champions that were those folks that were advocating and pushing and making sure that that pilot was going to be successful, they can leave. And that can be a big detriment to the pilot's success. Also, realizing that just a pilot doesn't necessarily equal real value to the company. There's still a lot of work to be done. And then also watching out when we are partnering with academic institutions does not mean that these are not ideal pilot partners for us, but most often when we are partnering with an academic center, their goal is not going to be commercialization or system-wide deployment. Their goal is going to be around publishing a paper. So as long as you go into it knowing that, then you're going to be okay. Maybe having the clinical evidence and that joint paper is all that you are really looking for, but just make sure that you're mindful of that. The other thing is a pitfall is I often talk to startups that maybe have multiple pilots going on at one time. There's nothing wrong with that, but it can be a big problem if you've got 5 pilots, for example, and all 5 of those pilots are different. It's going to make it very difficult for you to be able to have any type of comparative analysis of that data across a variety of pilots. So that's going to be certainly an issue. And then also when you're going through that pilot program and you're getting feedback from that pilot partner, just be mindful that you don't want to fall into the trap of customizing your solution for that single customer, but it's not something that's going to be commercially viable throughout your entire target audience. And it's a very costly mistake. So kind of flipping the script here, let's talk about what are some of those myths, barriers, and pitfalls for corporates. So corporates often think that their R&D and their innovation should be coming from in-house. It should be an in-house activity, and that process, that innovation process, should be controlled completely internally. Another myth that corporates often have is that, thinking about intellectual property and that it should be developed internally and it should be really not exposed outside of the company until it's really ready for a release. And if you are a corporate and you're kind of this mindset of 1 and 2 myths, it's going to be very difficult for you to have a successful pilot without having that mindset shift. Also, the third myth that I want to talk about today is that the pilot can be a lot more successful or thinking that your pilot can be a lot more successful if you're partnering with a startup that operates more like a mature company. Because let's face it, that the startup is going to look and behave and think and operate very differently than corporate. And that's intentionally so. And there's a lot of good reason for that. Another myth for corporate is that, sometimes corporate thinks that if they can get their pilot customer or their pilot startup to agree to do this for free, that's going to be a good thing or at very little cost. And very often, if startups do agree to those types of terms, it really puts the corporate at risk of having a very unsuccessful pilot because you're putting a lot of resource constraint on the startup and them not being able to perform well during that program. It's one of the other myths is that it's impossible to establish a hard stop and start date. When we're thinking about these pilot programs, especially from the corporate lens, we think that, well, it's really hard because we've got all of these obstacles and all of these approval processes that we have to go to. And we really don't know when we're going to get to that statistical significance to be able to demonstrate that this hypothesis is valid or not. And so we think when we're negotiating upfront that we really can't come up with a hard start and stop date, but that really is a myth. We can, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. What are some of the guardrails that we can put in place for that? And this last myth that I want to just point out is that, sometimes corporates will think that we really don't need to talk about what the next steps are if that pilot is successful, because we really just need to be able to see that the startup solution is working effectively first. And that really is a myth. We want to assume that the pilot is going to be successful, and really early on in that process, we want to be able to talk through what's going to happen next when it is successful. That will definitely be very beneficial for all parties that are involved. Some of the additional barriers that I want to kind of highlight here for corporates is certainly securing the necessary capital and resources for sustaining the pilot. So just as those resources and that capital is important for the startup, it's just as important for corporate as well to be able to allocate those resources, not just in the beginning of the pilot, but for the entire duration. So it's something that we need to be planful of. Otherwise, it will be a barrier to the pilot success. Also, just finding out ways to be able to overcome these long and complicated approval processes that are really common in a number of different places throughout the program. Also, leadership turnover. So this can be a barrier. There's been pilot engagements that I've worked with where the CEO or maybe a business unit leader changes. There's some kind of turnover there. And so then priorities change, visions change, and that can be a barrier to the success. So you want to just think about that going in to the program development. Also, from a corporate standpoint, you can have blockers. So even if the CEO of the company says yes, or the business unit leader says yes, you can still have blockers throughout, from the top to the bottom, throughout the organization in all of these different phases of the pilot process. And making sure that you're mindful of these barriers is really important, so that way you can come up with strategies on how to overcome them. And then the last barrier that I want to point out is just, I kind of touched on this a little bit with number 3, is just these different and competing visions among corporate stakeholders. Sometimes from a corporate lens, it can come out after the pilot is already underway that there's key stakeholders within the organization that really want to take the business and take the resources in very different directions. And that certainly can be a barrier to success. And then lastly, I want to talk about these corporate pitfalls. So oftentimes corporate will underestimate and improperly prepare for the time and the financial resources that are required to support this project. So we want to make sure that we're watching out for that throughout the entire phase of the process. Also, we want to watch out for that, being mindful as we are negotiating and selecting those startups that we want to work with. We want to make sure that they're going to be sustainable as well, that we are not going to pick a pilot partner that's a startup that's going to be maybe terminating this product or solution down the way, or even then having to dissolve their business for one reason or another. That's certainly another pitfall that can hinder success. And then startups and corporates speak very different languages, right? This is something that inherently we know, but this can be a big pitfall to a pilot program success. Understanding that those different types of organizations, they speak different languages, they certainly run at different speeds, and really each organization exists for very different purposes. So these can be pitfalls that we also want to watch for. And then last but not least is just changing in environmental trends in the environment and in the trends. And I think COVID is certainly an example of that, where we've seen different things that are just completely out of our control happening in the environment that can negatively impact our pilot programs. And we want to be able to be mindful of that, so that way we can come up with strategies to overcome them. So we talked about the bad and the ugly, right? Kind of the myths, the pitfalls, and the barriers. So I want to highlight on the good, right? So let's talk about how startups and corporates can pilot to profit and really be able to achieve those better outcomes that are going to lead to success. So I want to start off with talking about some universal tips. So some tips that really apply to both the startup and the corporate. And then after this, I'll break apart some special tips that I have for startups and some that I have just for corporates. So first and foremost, my number 1 tip is really be selective on when you're choosing your pilot partner, right? All pilot partners are not equal, and you want to make sure that you're picking one that's for you. Sometimes we get really excited, like I was talking about, especially as a startup, when someone says yes, that they will do a pilot engagement with us, that we kind of forget that we should be doing some of that vetting and qualifying process. So I would suggest that in this journey, whether you're a startup or corporate, you want to be able to have this acceptance criteria and reject criteria. You really want to sit down and actually write out which are the characteristics or the traits that you're looking for that is going to be that ideal pilot for you. And then what are the things that are your reject criteria? So if you are, negotiating and talking with someone, you can all be a little bit more decisive about that decision making, because you've already documented who's a fit for you and who it isn't, and use that as a lens to make that selection. Number 2, I would say, make sure that you're finding the measures that matter the most, and that you're setting these performance-based expectations up front. So a lot of times the things that we can measure that are really easy to measure aren't necessarily those KPIs or those attributes that are going to help us determine whether we're successful or not. So really being able to dig into what's going to be most meaningful to you. Like you can see kind of in these visuals that I have here on the slide, I recommend that both the corporate as well as the startup come up with these learning cards and these test cards, and really in the beginning of the process, really being able to define the hypothesis. What exactly are you testing in this pilot program? And then what's going to happen if A, B, and C happens? What are you looking for? And then the learning card is really important. It doesn't have to be this card, but any type of learning tool. That way, if for some reason you have a successful failure, you're still learning from it, right? So maybe at the end of the pilot, you don't have the evidence that proves the hypothesis that you had gone into the pilot program with, but at least you're capturing the learnings so that as you go into another pilot, that you are being able to apply that so you can do things differently so it can lead to success. So tip number 3, I say that planning is crucial. I think that we know that we need to create a plan, but I kind of mapped out a number of factors that I think are really important for you to have in your pilot plan. So it's like Stephen Covey, right? Beginning with the end in mind, making sure that you have a plan, that you are defining the scope and duration of that you have outlined what are the benefits that both the corporate and the startup are expecting to get out of this relationship. How is data going to be collected and assessed? I see this as a common issue that we kind of don't map out all of these details in the beginning. And so it's kind of like midway that we realize that, there's certain people that have access to the data that we need to be able to prove or disprove those hypotheses, but we don't have access to the data. And now it becomes a barrier and an obstacle for us because we can't get through that. And so it really hinders our success. So the more of this stuff that you're mapping out up front, the more successful that you're going to be. Every single pilot, no matter how amazing that startup is, no matter how amazing that corporate is, every single pilot program is going to be prone for risks and challenges. So even in the beginning of that process, you really want to be able to think about what are some of those risks and those obstacles and anticipate those. And you want to be able to identify them, and then collectively the two groups coming together on how are you going to address those logistical hurdles? How are you going to address maybe some regulatory or data access concerns, whatever. I pointed out here, lengthy negotiations, coming to those terms so that way you're setting those expectations up front from both parties, and then also having a plan on how you're going to overcome them is really important. And this is one that I really stress a lot in this plan, is making sure that you're mapping out with both parties how the project might scale up and spread if it is a success. Everyone's going to benefit when you're mapping that out in advance. So very similar to the pilot plan, you want to also have a pilot agreement. And again, this might seem like a no-brainer, but I can't tell you how many, especially startups, that get so excited about the pilot opportunity that they actually overlook taking the pilot agreement, making that step, and actually thinking through all of the components of the agreement to make sure that it's going to be really effective and that you're thinking through these things together. So you really want to determine what are going to be the costs of the pilot, and how is it going to be shared among the startups and the corporate? Who's paying for what? How are those resources being shared? You also wanted to agree on how you're going to staff the project, right? So a lot of times we don't realize the resources that are needed, not just to secure the pilot and come to the approval process of getting it on board, but for the life of the pilot engagement, you want to make sure that it's going to be staffed correctly so it can be successful. We talked about this a little bit already, just the wildly successful mapping out in the agreement that if A, B, and C happens, and this is especially for the startup, that you're negotiating future sales on the back end. Right? You don't want all of your pilots to lead to just your clinical evidence. You want to be able to negotiate those future sales up front, as well as for the corporate. You want to think about if this is successful, you want to be able to set expectations on what you're looking for from the startup. You want to make sure that you're talking about how you're going to be sharing information and transparent with one another and making that part of the agreement. And also, I think this is really important too, is that how is the evidence that you're collecting going to be able to translate across other populations? We'll also talk about that a little bit more. Exit clauses, right? Sometimes you come to an agree, you engage, everything seems wonderful in the beginning, but you come to a point in that pilot program that for one reason or another, one party needs to exit that engagement. You want to be able to map that out in the pilot agreement. And then I say that you want to determine a hard start and a hard stop on the pilot term. So this, in some ways, you're going to be doing this based upon experience and based upon understanding your particular solution that you're bringing into the corporate and the terms of your specific engagement. And then at the same time, you are making some assumptions on when that project's going to end. And that doesn't mean that the pilot has to end at that hard date. But what happens is when you put together a start date and a stop date, it creates more accountability and it creates more urgency for things to move forward. So you think about the barriers and some of the obstacles that we talked about. If you have a hard stop date, that you might have a little bit more urgency to move some of those approvals throughout the process and to be able to get access to that data, because you've got a timeline or a deadline associated with it. So the worst thing that you could do would be just to leave that open-ended, because you can't really anticipate what that's going to look like. The last universal tip that I have, actually, I think this is number 5, I'm getting number 6, is really just kind of thinking about how you're going to adapt to this new normal. So wherever you are in the world and what that context looks like for you related to COVID, really just adapting to this new normal of virtual. So, prior to COVID, we thought that our pilot programs had to be face-to-face, and all of those meetings, getting those users, getting feedback from those users, and we kind of really need to reimagine what this pilot engagement would look like. It's going to be a lot more cost prohibitive if we can leverage some of these digital tools and kind of leverage more of a virtual or remote environment. And then make sure that even if you're the startup or the corporate, that you not only have buy-in from the corporate CEO, but that basically that you've got all the leaders from the different business units that are responsible for profit and loss that are enthusiastically involved. This is really important, because if you're getting the different leaders to think about the business impact that the pilot has, the potential that that pilot has, they're going to be more engaged than thinking of it as just as a research project. So here's a handful of tips that are just for the startups, right? So you want to make sure that you're reserving capital for clinical validation. I can't tell you how many startups I talk to where they're getting funding, they're getting seed money, and they are allocating majority of those resources to the solution, and really not leaving enough resources to be able to have these kind of clinical pilots happening, to be able to establish the evidence that's going to be so important for them in this commercialization process. Also, you want to make sure that when you're looking for your pilot partner, that you're not partnering with these late majority or these laggards, that you're looking for those early adopters. I think when you're working with organizations like Plug and Play that are matching you with those corporates, it's much easier to make sure that you are engaging with those early adopters. But if you're going outside of that, this is just something that you want to be mindful of, because those early majority, those late majority, those people that are later in that diffusion curve, they are just going to waste your time. They're going to waste your money, and they could absolutely end up being a death trap. And sometimes they will just say yes to doing a pilot, and you'll think that that's very exciting, but they have no intentions of buying or operationalizing your solution. So you want to be mindful of that. I also say that once the pilot engagement, the agreement, the plan, all of that is done and the program is underway, you want to network. This is going to be your strategy for being able to make sure that if some of those champions that you had end up leaving, that you're networking with other people in the organization that can replace that role. That's going to be really important. And then just making sure that that you, when you're getting that feedback, that you are not customizing your solution. We touched on this a little bit, but I think it's really important just to reemphasize, because it's so easy when we've got those pilot partners that maybe even have infused some capital into this. It's so easy for us to then put all the features and all the functionality that they are wanting to make that solution work for them, but that it's really not going to work for the entire commercialization strategy for the startup. And you, again, kind of going back to that accept reject criteria, being able to identify who you are and who you're not, so you don't get caught up in the excitement of turning your entire business into something that it really doesn't even align with the original vision and mission that you had for the company. This is one I see happen really often. And then just a couple of tips for the corporates that are here on today's session is making sure that we are thinking about how this pilot can lead to new streams of revenue and new business lines of revenue. Similar to what I was talking about before, the more we can get those corporate stakeholders thinking about the clinical and the business impact that this pilot is going to have, the more success we will have with getting buy-in and support and being able to cross the finish line with these pilots. Making sure that as we go through this and we're working with these startups, that we realize that we really function in different ways, and kind of expecting the pilot program to be a little bit more characteristic of a startup, right? So although the corporate is going to be traditionally, maybe somewhat bureaucratic and having a lot of structure and systems and processes to go through, we really want to be able to have those pilot programs be more agile and more flexible and nimble, like a startup organization, because you want to be able to move those pilots as fast as you possibly can to be able to get to that evidence to prove or disprove that hypothesis. Just like the startup, we can't just launch the pilot and then kind of expect to walk away from it. So really being able to stay on top of the deployment of the pilot is going to be really, really important for success. I know that we always have so many competing priorities, especially, attention is stretched so thin these days, but really being able to stay highly focused and engaged in the pilot is going to be really important. And this one I can't stress enough is that, a tip for corporate is that really from the very beginning, you're thinking about strategies of how this pilot program could potentially scale and spread throughout the larger part of the organization. And here's some tips that I have here on the screen of ways that you can do that. So certainly looking at some of these methods and these modeling tools and these evaluation techniques. So these are 4 ways that you could actually move the pilot faster and also the evaluation process faster to be able to get to that large scale implementation. And if you want to talk to me a little bit more about this after today's session, I can dig into some of this in more in depth. But making sure that the leadership and the culture is supporting the rollout of these programs. That really ultimately, if these pilots are successful, we're talking about a pretty significant change that's going to happen that need to be permeated throughout the organization. So, but having those strategies and that mindset from the very beginning is really important. So as we kind of start to come to a close here, thinking about this big question. So how can either side, whether you're the startup or the corporate, how do you know when you should end a pilot or when it should keep on going? Right? I mean, you've had this experience, or someone that's been in a pilot that maybe is going on for 2 or 3 years. And in some ways, that's not a bad thing. But I kind of want to point out, these are some ways that, or some points that you would know that you want to end the pilot. So if you've reached the minimal time that's required to establish the evidence to either prove or disprove your hypothesis, it's time to end the pilot. That sometimes that might actually be much shorter timeframes than you think. So knowing how much data do you need? What are the thresholds for that data that needs to be established just for you to be able to prove or disprove that hypothesis? that would be a key indicator that it's time to wrap up the pilot. Another one is when the context or the variables of the pilot change in such a way to where it can no longer be successful. So let's say, for example, the champion that you had that was really spearheading the pilot is no longer with the organization, and the new team members that have taken their place have different priorities, have a different strategic vision for the organization. Those are major shifts that are red flags that indicate that the context of this pilot is no longer the same. And so no matter how long you have the pilot, it's not going to be successful. So that would also be another indicator that it's time to end the pilot. And then the third one that I wanted to point out was that when you agree to what that hard start and stop is in the beginning of that planning process, once that process has expired, if the project milestones have still not been met, this is not to say that you should end the pilot, but this is should say that both parties should come together and talk about, is this a time for us to end the pilot? So let's say, for example, in the agreement or in the planning process, you determined that you, in your best estimate, that this pilot engagement is going to last about a year. Then you want to keep that deadline in mind for the entire duration of the pilot. Then when you get to the 1 year or close to it, then you want to be able to assess whether you've achieved those project milestones. And if not, then you want to be able to schedule a meeting and all parties are kind of coming to the table and reevaluating, do we want to extend the pilot because we think that this can still be successful, and kind of come up with another end date? Or have we come to terms for one reason or another where this is just not working out and we need to terminate the pilot? So that's all that I have for you today. I wanted to also share that there's a free resource that you can download. So if any of you are in the piloting process now and you want to kind of dive deeper into some of the information that I shared, you want to hit www in front of it. But if you hit legacydna-dna.com, it's our website /pilot-roadmap. And we'll put the link in the chat, or we can also, Ava can send a follow-up to you all with the link if you want to download that resource. That's something that we're handing out for free. Also, another resource is that I host and produce a video podcast called The Health Innovator Show. We talk a lot about piloting amongst other topics. So if you haven't already subscribed, feel free to do that. And now it is Q&A time.
Awesome. Does anyone have any questions? You feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can drop them in the chat. I do see one. Oh, go ahead.
Thanks so much. And Dr. Mooney, thank you very much for your time today. So my question is about agreeing on final sales terms. I would be concerned about doing that in a pilot context, because to me, that would seem you'd now have to get more decision makers involved. In order to, okay, well, if the pilot's successful, then we're going to do this, but that means that now the CEO needs to be involved, or other people, and that might slow things down, especially when you haven't even proven anything yet, right? You're still testing. Do you have any thoughts on that? Does it seem to me like I'd just like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really valid point, but I would say that if it takes you a little bit longer to get some additional approvals, to make sure that the engagement is leading to business impact, that can still prove to be extremely very beneficial, and maybe more worth the investment than just having a pilot that doesn't lead to future sales. So you can figure out how to word that clause or those terms in your pilot agreement. It could be in such a way to where if A, B, and C happens, that there will be some type of analysis on how this would be deployed and spread throughout the organization. And you
like
can get
agreement in principle. If this works, then here's what we do next, and just get everyone to agree on that, and then they're at least their honors on the line.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that it can be either or, and it really just depends on what is going to serve you best. So if you are in a situation to where you are really wanting these pilot programs to lead to future sales, then I would say that you might not want to be just in principle, but you might want to have some specificity into the agreement. If for you at this stage in your commercialization journey that you're really more inclined to benefit from the clinical evidence and maybe some type of peer-reviewed study or maybe some type of endorsement, and then I think the clause in principle would be just suitable for you. I think that there's some pros and cons on where you are.
I totally understand. It's like a stage thing. If you already have, like, if you're already surviving and you're trying to actually turn a pilot into sales, just get that work out of the way ahead of time, or else what are you doing there? I get it. Thank you so much for your time.
Correct. Yeah, exactly.
To layer on that, I think it's important to your point earlier, understand what the outcome needs to be about the pilot before you start the pilot. And if it's a clinical outcome, if it's a white paper, if it's a expanded business, try to be as specific as possible in that pilot agreement, because that makes your work a lot easier 6, 9, 12 months from that point forward. So,
and I think that also just knowing what it is for you is also really important when you are courting pilot partners and determining whether they're a fit for you or not, because that could be that alignment could be there, or that misalignment could be there. And so if your intention and your goal or outcome that you're looking for the pilot is very different than what that pilot partner is, you still might be able to map out an agreement and a plan. But if you're misaligned, then you're not going to have success. You're going to have that tension that's going to rear itself throughout the entire pilot program. And no one will be happy. Everybody will just be completely frustrated. So you're right. So what is the mapping out in that plan? How is this pilot going to benefit the startup? What are you looking for? How is this pilot going to benefit corporate? What are you looking for? Are you on the same page? If not, can we negotiate and get on the same page? If not, then maybe at phase, we determine that we really aren't the best fit for each other and there's a better pilot partner out there for us.
I got a question. When thinking about engaging with like a larger health system, is there any recommendation on whether or not to enter via the clinical teams and trying to find a clinical champion first versus going in through sort of the corporate level?
I think that varies. I don't think that that's really like a black and white example or a hard and fast. I think that it could vary depending on what your goal is, who you have connections with in your network, right? So you could go in through clinical and it leads you to corporate and the clinicals become your advocates. Or it could be vice versa, where it's corporate that then weaves into clinical. I think either way, you have to have both parties getting buy-in from them and supporting the initiative. Again, otherwise, I think that if you get clinical, that you might struggle with being able to get that resourced to be a sustainable pilot. And you also, might not lead to future sales because it's just kind of a clinical initiative. And I also think if it's just clinical, then you also are at risk to really get caught and stuck in some of those obstacles of the approval process and some of the bureaucracy, because, unfortunately, let's face it, it's like the money really drives behavior. So if you can have the business case and the business unit leaders involved, that type of business potential is really going to drive the urgency. So I think involving both parties will be really important. And it doesn't matter how you get your foot in the door. Just squeeze that foot in there.
Any other questions?
I have a quick question. Dr. Mooney, when would you say is the right time? It seems to me, and tell me that this is an incorrect assumption, that the right time to negotiate terms in terms of like payment potentially from the corporate to the startup would be after we've fully define and flesh the scope and all of the objectives and things like that, because then you can attach it back to the time and resources needed to make it happen. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
And what percentage of these pilots would you say are paid versus are not paid? Like, is it like 99%, 50? Like, how many, do you have a range?
I would say in my experience, more of them are unpaid than paid because of the reasons that I noted, because most often that startup is just so excited that someone said yes, that they acquiesce all of that negotiation power. And I think that that's why we have so much, so many people that end up in pilot purgatory and so many pilot programs that end up not being successful, because you have very resource constraint startups that can't perform effectively because they just don't have the resources. Not that long ago, I was talking to someone that had 17 pilots going on at the same time, and they were startup, and they were waving that like a flag of like a badge of honor, like, I've got 17 pilots going on. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's like, to me that spells disaster. Like, wow, how as a startup are you really adequately supporting 17 pilots? Supporting one or two can be a challenge. So I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, that we really want to be able to see that shift where there's more an exchange of dollars upfront, so that way both parties can be successful and it can be more of a win-win solution. Because I think that will lead to more successful pilots, will then lead to more of that successful, spreading and deployment and being able to transform healthcare.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? No? Cool. Well, good. Well, thank you so much, Roxie, for taking the time. I'm happy for all the startups on the line to share the recording with you, and share more details on how to connect with Roxie after this. Let us know if you have any other questions. Roxie, not sure if you wanted to mention anything as we close out here, but appreciate everyone taking the time, and we'll see you all very soon.
Yeah, just, let me or Ava know whether this workshop was helpful to you. If there are other questions that you have or other topics, subtopics around piloting that you'd like to see me address in the future, I'm certainly open to that feedback to make sure that, together we're delivering the most value to you possible. And if we're not connected on LinkedIn, reach out to me. I push out a lot of content there. Love to help.
Cool. Thank you so much, Roxie, and
Thank
thanks
you.
everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it. Bye-bye.